Now we get it. Perfect. So now we get into the meat of things. Again, welcome to our new webinar series on One Health. As I mentioned previously, this series is being organized or co-organized with PanWorks, which is a nonprofit think tank for the well-being of animals. We have worked with PanWorks in the past. They are fantastic. I strongly encourage you to connect with them. And we look forward to coordinating other webinar series in the future. So in addition to that, I also mentioned that this webinar series is being co-hosted with SCBNA's Policy Committee. For those of you that are not aware of what SCBNA is, we are a professional society dedicated to advancing the science and practice of conserving Earth's biological diversity. That essentially means that we support everyone and anyone engaged in conservation. And we do that through a variety of different ways. But mostly what we do is we offer professional development opportunities for conservation practitioners and scientists. We also host a number of research and publication journals that members have access to. And then we host a biannual conference, which seeks to bring together conservation practitioners in North America, the next iteration of which is taking place this summer in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And I'm happy to talk a bit more about that later on. For those of you that are not members of SCBNA, I encourage you to join. You get a lot of really cool benefits by becoming part of the society. And we have also recently released an associate membership, which is absolutely free for anyone that needs it. So please take advantage of it. You can join using the QR code on the screen, but I will also include pertinent links and everything else in the chat in just a few minutes. Okay, so a little bit about our One Health series. For those of you that don't know what the One Health is, it is an integrated, unifying approach that aims to sustainably balance and optimize the health of people, animals, and ecosystems. It is a really interesting concept that has taken off within a number of conservation circles. So we wanted to explore it in greater detail and really provide an overview for our members, especially those that participated in our last ethics webinar series. As a result, the series that we have prepared for the next few weeks will explore the pillars of One Health, its historical context, and also examples of real-world application and conservation initiatives. Today, we will do a quick overview of One Health, and then we have two more upcoming webinars that will tap into the historical and practical considerations and real-world examples. Both of those webinars are available on our website. You can register for them today so that you have them on your schedule in the future. Okay, so last but not least, I am really excited to introduce our speaker for today. Joanne Lindenmayer is an adjunct associate professor of public health at Tufts University School of Medicine, and she is also a fellow of PanWorks. Joanne has also been involved in a number of other projects with their policy committee, and she has been fantastic in just informing us and teaching us more about One Health and its usefulness for our members and practitioners in the conservation world. So Joanne, thank you so much for joining us today, and I will open the floor to you in your presentation.
Thank you, Bernie, and thank you, Bill, and welcome everybody who's attending. And I'm really excited to give you, to sort of present some background information on One Health and to share with you some of my thoughts about how it might or might not apply to conservation. But more than anything, I am looking forward to the discussion because I think there's a lot to be discussed related to One Health and conservation. So I want to mention that I worked on this presentation with my colleague Gretchen Kaufman, who's a wildlife veterinarian. And also let's see, where are we going here? For some reason, this is not, oh, there we go. And also with some contributions from some of my fellows at PanWorks. This was, excuse me, initially a presentation that we gave at Yale to the an ethics group that I forget formally the name of it. Bill, do you remember?
It's the Animal Ethics Group of
Animal Ethics. Thank you.
The Institute
okay.
for Bioethics.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so this is quite a bit modified from that initial presentation, but anyway, let's go. So this is a brief overview of where we're going to go with this. First, the rationale and a brief history of One Health, how it relates to other healths, the evolution of the definition, which I think presents us with a number of challenges, and then what are some of the challenges that are presented. First of all, what is health? How is it actually implemented from beginning concept all the way to policy and programs? Is there such a thing as One Health ethics, and some of the challenges that are based largely on the definition of One Health, the most recent definition, that is. So what's the rationale? And I know I probably don't need to say anything to this audience, but I happen to like this quote by David Attenborough. No species has ever had such wholesale control over everything on Earth, living or dead, as we now have. It lays upon us, whether we like it or not, an awesome responsibility. In our hands now lies not only our own future, but that of other living creatures with whom we share the Earth. And am I having trouble with this? So some of the things that are considered to be One Health challenges these days, and I know you're probably familiar with many of them, but the Black Fire, the summer of fires in Australia in 2019 and 2020, where an estimated 3 billion wild animals lost their lives, and yet the data set that captures disasters worldwide starting in 1900 did not consider this a disaster from the point of view of the wild animals. It was classified as a disaster because 26 people lost their lives. And I am always astounded by that. So many of you have seen those horrible pictures. So that is certainly, the disasters cause some hazards that are presented to us largely by global warming and climate change. It's certainly a One Health challenge. The deaths of thousands of elephant seals from avian influenza is another one. You can see this photograph here. In that case, it was a pathogen that was transmitted from birds to elephant seals. And then, of course, the opposite, which is considered to be a zoonosis, Ebola from non-human primates to people in West Africa. And that covered several countries and killed a lot of people, as well as primates, non-human primates that were captive in zoos, and probably those in the forest as well. And then lastly, a related, what I consider to be a disaster. This is an area where I spent several years in the Peace Corps. But if you recognize, this is Sabah, which is on the north part of the island of Borneo, and is contained in East Malaysia. And from 1950, this was the palm oil coverage of palm oil plantations. And then you can see where it was in 2020. So the palm oil plantations have been largely, I'm sorry, this is this is not palm oil plantation. This is the ecosystem that has been decimated by the palm oil plantation. So now it's largely monoculture. I drove from the eastern part of the island, the western part of the island, to the eastern part of the island in 2018, and there's almost nothing but palm oil plantations. And of course, that was the home of what we call in English called the orangutans, but in Malay they're called the orang hutans, which means person of the jungle. So these are all One Health challenges because they involve the health of people, other animals, and ecosystems, and in the natural environment. All right, so a brief history, because I think Dr. Coons is going to go into this a little bit more deeply in his presentation. But before we had, modern medicine, whether it's veterinary medicine or human medicine, healers in some of these countries used to treat people and other animals as though there was no difference between them. So they applied the same types of treatments to them in order to treat diseases. And then, so that was several millennia ago. In the mid 1800s, there was the microbiological revolution, starting with Pasteur, and the technological revolution. And this led to the separation of human and other animal health. And in fact, human health became much more technologically competent, veterinary medicine lagged quite far behind, and at that time was still largely focused on horses. In the 1800s as well, Dr. Rudolf Virchow, who was a pathologist, he recognized that between when he was doing necropsies for people and other animals that had died, he said there was no dividing line, nor should there be. And in fact, we now know in a book that was published several years ago called Zubiquity, most of the diseases that people get, other animals get as well, and many of them are treated in exactly the same way. So I think that was somewhat surprising to physicians, but veterinarians knew that all along. Then in 1979, Dr. Calvin Schwabe, who was an epidemiologist and veterinarian at the University of California in Davis, coined this term one medicine, largely to reflect Dr. Virchow's observations, not only in terms of presentation of diseases, but also in terms of their treatment. So we called it one medicine. And it was called one medicine up until about the late 1970s. And in fact, the Tufts University School of Veterinary Medicine, now known as the Cummings School, was founded on the principle of one medicine. And the way it was founded was they basically admitted several classes of veterinarians and sent them to the medical school downtown. And we were taught by physicians and a few veterinarians, and that lasted for a few years until the students said, "We've had enough of this. We're not learning anything about cows." And the medical faculty said, "We don't know what these veterinarians need." And the veterinarians were unhappy as well. So that's when we sort of split. And they founded the Cummings School of Veterinary Medicine on a campus about 40 miles west of Boston. But this expansion of medicine to include prevention really started with the Surgeon General's report on smoking. And it expanded the previous idea of just treating diseases to include preventing diseases. So stopping smoking if one was were smoking, and not starting smoking if one were not smoking. And then finally, this whole thing. So that was originally kind of a collaboration between veterinarians and human physicians. And then with the Manhattan Principles in the Wildlife Conservation Society was a meeting in 2004, which elaborated on the importance of biodiversity and extended that idea of health of humans and other animals to include ecosystems. So you hear a lot about other healths these days, and there are relationships with One Health, but I kind of think of One Health as being the overriding concept. So if you look at One Health, it's people, other animals, and ecosystems. If you look at environmental health, the large concept there is really the health of the environment. But as we know, largely defined by public health, environmental health largely refers to how people are affected by pollution, sick building syndrome, those kinds of things. So it's really the impact on people and nothing else. Ecosystem health is a broader concept, but it doesn't really break it down much more into individuals and different species. It's more a very broad concept. Public health, of course, is only about people, and it does include animal health, but only insofar as we get bad diseases from those bad animals. Global health is nothing much more than just public health on a global level. You have planetary health, which kind of burst onto the scene about 10 or 15 years ago. Planetary health is largely defined by, again, how humans are affected by the health of the planet. And most of the metrics of planetary health, in fact, I think pretty much all of them, are how they impact humans. They lump animals with environment, and they don't really separate them out. So, and each one of these four organizations are probably the big players in One Health globally, but each one of them defines One Health somewhat differently. So if you're at CDC, where I was for several years, their main emphasis is on zoonotic diseases and antimicrobial resistance. And OIE, which is this now WOA, the World Organization for Animal Health, is largely focused on the health of other animals. WHO, again, focused largely on people to some extent, FAO, and the health of livestock. So there are all these other healths, but I personally consider One Health to be the overriding, and that these other healths fall within the big remit of One Health. So the evolution of the definition of One Health was first defined in about 2008. The American Veterinary Medical Association, the president of the AVMA and the president of the AMA got together, and they defined One Health as the collaborative effort of multiple disciplines working locally, nationally, and globally to obtain optimal health for people, animals, and our environment. And I'm going to comment on that. Fortunately, that has expanded in the last 15 or so years, a little bit more. And in 2021, there was a global convening of One Health experts called the One Health High Level Expert Panel. And they expanded that definition tremendously. So they added things like it's an integrated, unifying approach, sustainably balance and optimize the health of people, animals, and ecosystems. It recognized, let's say, the wider environment, recognized that those were linked, not only linked, but the real important concept here is that they're interdependent. And this is often forgotten. People often mention the links, but they forget to mention the interdependence. And that's key, especially when we're thinking about conservation. It mobilizes multiple sectors. So we still have that. So private sector, public sector, and multiple disciplines, but it also adds communities. So when you think about the knowledge that indigenous communities have in terms of the health of those communities, the health of the animals, the health of the ecosystems, that is something that had previously been largely ignored. The scientists would get in there, muck around, figure out what was best for a particular challenge, and then go in there and load something onto a community. And I think especially when I was in Indonesia in 2010 working on avian influenza, the people in the Tyvek suits that went into small landholding, small farmer communities that had chickens and told them that their chickens had some invisible disease and they needed to kill them all to keep people healthy and to keep the disease from spreading to other chickens. That was a non-starter. People started hiding their chickens. Of course they did, because their chickens died all the time. And when they died, they just ate them. So having these people in white Tyvek suits from a Western mindset come in and tell them what to do with their chickens did not end well. And then let's see, the other things I wanted to point out, collective need for clean water, energy, and air, and all the rest of it, which is something that we all need. Okay, so that has expanded quite a bit since then. There are still problems with this definition, and I will go into some of those. So what are those challenges? What are the challenges from the concept to the actual implementation of One Health in policy and programs? So first of all, I have a problem with the term health. And if you look at the WHO definition, which was defined by in 1946, health for people was a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not just the absence of disease or infirmity. And that's great because it speaks to aspects that are more than just physical. So it included mental health and also social well-being. But if you look at the definition of health for other animals, it often doesn't include mental and social well-being. And we know that animals are kept in laboratories, are kept in zoos, are kept in other places where their mental and social well-being is hugely compromised. So this definition, that it's the ability of the animal to cope, the reason they have to cope is because we often define the conditions in which they're kept. And so it doesn't necessarily involve what I consider to be mental and social well-being. This usually is not applied to other animals, especially when we're thinking about production medicine. And then a healthy ecosystem has been defined as one that is sustainable, ability to maintain structure and function over time in the face of external stress. I happen to like this one a lot because I think it also applies if we were looking for a foundational definition of health. I think that this definition could also be applied to One Health, to other animals, that is, and to people. Could be a sort of a foundation. So the question that I have is, can there be a single working definition of health? We refer to the One Health definition. Is there such a thing as a single working definition of health? And is it just to apply a broad definition of health that includes well-being only to people and not to other animals and perhaps even to ecosystems? So these are some questions I hope for discussion. The way that One Health is illustrated, and this was the way it began and is still largely the way One Health is illustrated. There's a circle, it's a Venn diagram. Animal health is over here, human health is here, environmental health is here, and that intersection is One Health. But this assumes that there is such a thing as animal health without human health and environmental health. And there is such a thing as human health without animal health and environmental health or ecosystem health. So my problem with this is that it separates humans from other animals because we know we are animals. It implies that humans and other animals exist apart from the environment or the ecosystem. It gives equal weight to all three domains. Human is one species. Other animals, there are an estimated 8.5 million that we know about, and then plenty that we don't know about. And I honestly cannot tell you how many species of plants and protozoa and every other thing that is living exists out there. So it says this one species deserves a whole lot more attention than do the other millions, perhaps billions of living beings that are out there. And it presumes that disciplinary expertise is sufficient to achieve One Health. And we already mentioned that idea of transdisciplinarity, which is how crucial it is to involve people not only in their understanding of what the health problems are in their environment, but also in the potential solutions to that. So this is an illustration that Dr. Kaufman and I came up with. Actually, her niece developed this. And, I'd like to be able to do it to scale. I think it's not possible, but we locate, sorry, let me get back to that. We locate humans squarely within the animal kingdom and everybody else within an ecosystem. So I'd like to see this take purchase. So far, it really hasn't, but I think it's a much better illustration of what One Health really is. So concept to implementation, we talk about, what are the issues with One Health from the interdependence concept all the way to the way that it's implemented in policy and programs. So first of all, we know that the health of people, other animals, and nature is inextricably connected. Of course, pets, everybody knows about pets. The health of their pets affects their health of their family or an individual. Nobody has any problems with that. What about livestock? So we know that livestock, most of them are kept in concentrated animal feeding operations. You know that only because people eat meat, but we don't think about so much antimicrobial resistance, all the antimicrobial drugs that are loaded on livestock. We don't think about how the health of livestock affects us too much because we go to the supermarket and we buy a piece of meat in a plastic container. And the thought there of how we are impacted or how we are dependent on the health of those livestock is less than it is with respect to our animals because we have much closer contact with them. And then this is something that I want to pose and I hope comes up in our discussion. What about the health of everything else on the planet? So these are lanternflies. Does the health of lanternflies, what is our relationship? What is our dependency on the health of lanternflies? It may not be immediately apparent. It may not be direct contact, but is there some connection, even if it's somewhat, it's not immediately apparent, even if it's somewhat connected, but not directly? Is there some impact on the health of other species besides the ones that we have more direct connection with? And should we be worried about that? So what is One Health research? Well, I took this from a great article by Humboldt and her colleagues. And so they looked at One Health publications from 1998 to 2019. These are all research publications. And they found, first of all, that they increased in absolute and relative terms. And this is because there's been a great interest in One Health and a lot of funding given to what are called One Health challenges. But most of those challenges are in microbiology, parasitology, infectious diseases, and general sciences. Why is that? That's because they affect people. And of course, in that period of time, from 1990 up to today, really, Ebola virus, avian influenza, all the other diseases that people get. It's sexy. Funders like to fund it, and people in academic institutions and other places want to do research on it, and they get a lot of publications. And this has largely been what it's about. The environment is rarely included. It's almost never included, and I will talk about that in a minute too. And that these journals promoting interdisciplinary research are lacking. So mostly the One Health stuff comes out in infectious disease research journals, veterinary medical journals, and those kind of things. Those disciplines, or there's journals that cover social, anthropological, and political research don't really cover One Health. And then it's being published outside the top tier journal outlets. So these are some of the findings of her bibliographic research. What about policies and programs? One Health and policies and programs are largely being dictated by these intergovernmental organizations, WHO, FAO, OIE, now WOAH and CDC, and the World Bank largely bankrolls those. And so those are the ones that dominate the policy themes, and those are the ones that largely are focused on, largely, to be honest, zoonotic diseases, food policy, those kinds of things that affect people. The common policy themes are prevention and control of zoonotic diseases, biosecurity, and antimicrobial resistance. And those are defined because they affect people. Most of those initiatives focus on proximal measures to protect people and rarely consider externalities. So what happens, what was our response to COVID, for example? We hurried up, we developed a COVID vaccine, and then we sort of forgot about everything else. But what about the health of non-human primates in the environment, in ecosystems in West Africa? Do we care about them at all? Are we doing anything to keep them healthy? I'll leave that to the discussion. And then most of the publications usually fair to consider these community values and indigenous knowledge, because to some extent we're still loading Western values onto communities, and we're failing to consider the knowledge that already exists in communities. We're also failing to consider what they consider to be their health problems. And if we do consider it all, we go to those communities and we do a survey and we find out what they think, and then we develop some kind of solution and then tell them what it is, essentially. It is One Health today is largely anthropocentric, and the challenges are defined, as I mentioned, by the impact on human health. This is a recent paper, the anthropocentric drift of One Health in practice, just published. And it's true because systemic biases towards human health are ensured because political and institutional priorities, as I mentioned, the intergovernmental organizations at the global level, organizational structures. If academic institutions have a One Health anything, what they do is they get people from the veterinary medical, environmental health, or ecosystem health and human health communities, all separate structures. They get them together in a room and they say, well, okay, what are we going to do about this? But there are very few institutions that actually have functional, viable One Health efforts. There are a few. University of California, Davis is one. But for the most part, it's getting a few faculty members together from these different disciplines and calling it One Health. And the funding streams largely dictated by the funding streams, which are interested in keeping people healthy. Okay, so what are options for not only ethics in One Health? And there have really been two approaches, actually three. So I don't know, I think some of you may be familiar with Hope Ferdowsian, who I think has done some fabulous work. When she has actually written a Belmont report for animals, taken the Belmont report, which was largely written in the wake of some of the experiments that were done on people in World War II by the Nazi regime. And the outcome of that was the Belmont report for people, which largely laid out some of the principles for human subjects research. And Hope and our colleagues took that, and they said, well, here's how we would apply that to animals being used in research in laboratories. So that's kind of one way to do it. This is, again, only really refers to research, but can we take pre-existing ethical frameworks and kind of expand them? Can we take those for environmental ethics, ethics of in animal research, ethics or other animal research, ethics in human research? Can we combine them into something? Can we think about how they would apply in other instances? And then with my colleagues from PanWorks, we developed some what we think are some basic principles that could apply regardless of whether we're talking about antimicrobial resistance, conservation biology, zoonotic disease transmission, any of these kinds of things. And the four that we kind of come up with were recognizing the interdependence of health and well-being among these different domains, incorporating physical, mental, emotional, and social well-being for all of them. That takes the WHO definition and uses it more broadly. Seeking to achieve optimal health simultaneously, which would mean that we may have to accept some trade-offs that don't necessarily privilege people. If we're looking to improve the health of non-human primates, maybe we pay more attention to Ebola virus in non-human primates. Then I don't know. I mean, these are tough decisions, and of course, people are predisposed to protect and want to be concerned and want to look at their own health and sort of make that the priority as opposed to the health of other animals in nature. And that we operate with scientific uncertainty and limited understanding. So we know so little about the rest of the world, and yet we still have to make some decisions, much as we often do, even in natural disasters. So we have to accept that there is some uncertainty and that we just don't know enough. And perhaps some of the research that we ought to maybe expand our research portfolio. Maybe we ought to acknowledge that, as I think we do sometimes, that we don't know enough. We've come up with the best solution that we have at the moment, but this may change. And I think we certainly saw that with COVID, where some initial research was sort of, we had to kind of change what we thought about what were the best ways, what were the best methods and the best protections to take. So the other options are to make this kind of a pluralistic thing. So I have a special issue on ethics coming out with Cabin One Health with Chris Degling, who's in Australia at Wollongong University. And his argument is that this really is situational, and it ought to be context dependent. So for each of these situations, we define or we kind of investigate the ethics, the One Health ethics of specific situations. So culling, for example, or emerging infectious diseases. Again, zoonosis. Emerging infectious diseases include zoonosis, but isn't limited to it. Here's another one, harm reduction. And I recently reviewed a paper on the One Health ethics of forced migration, people with their animals, often livestock. So is it situational? Are there broad, is it axiomatic? Are there broad principles and frameworks that we can develop? Or does it have to be situational and contextual? So I know you all have seen this, that's really the big remit here. How are we going to live? So now I'd like to switch into a discussion, keeping in mind that I don't have the answers. I will be a participant in this discussion, but I'm very, very interested in what you all think about how some of these considerations apply to conservation, where clearly it involves people, other animals, ecosystems, and it seems like there are clearly camps here. There's the camp of the people who want to go out and they want to hunt And then there's the camp of the people who really want to conserve animals. And then there's the whole issue of the ecosystem. So I'm going to stop this. I'm going to pull up the participants here so I can see your faces. And I'm going to be learning right alongside all of you. So thank you for your time and attention. And I'm looking forward to this discussion. I'm going to stop sharing right now. And hi, everybody.
Thanks so much, Joanne, for that overview and presentation. I'm wondering if there's any questions that you have to kick off the discussion.
That I have?
Yeah.
Well, I guess I'd really like to hear about, I'd like to hear what people's thoughts are. Does One Health apply to conservation? That would be
Pamela
my
has a
first question.
question. Pamela has a question. Maybe
Now,
that dovetails.
who's going to let her in? Not me, right?
Oh,
Or am
no,
I going
she's already here. She's just
Okay.
raised your hand. Go ahead,
You know-
Pamela.
Hi, I have a problem with the term conservation. I need to know exactly how that's defined here, because hunters and trappers describe themselves as conservationists too. So in this context, I'd like a little bit of clarification.
Don't ask me. I'm going to go to Bernie for that.
This is a fantastic question, Pamela, and also very opportune. I will say that SCBA has been working hard on our society's definition of conservation for a while. It is not public yet. But I think for the context of this, maybe we can approach the word conservation as looking at biodiversity as a whole and its relationship with humans. So preserving, restoring, managing wildlife for future generations.
Did you want to redirect there, Pamela? Does that make sense to you?
Well, it's probably not the answer I was looking for, but yes, I think I understand it. Thanks.
Yeah, I think there are different definitions of conservation, and people adopt different definitions depending on their point of view. I think some are more consonant with this One Health perspective than others, as you're pointing out. Yeah, thank you very much for that.
But I have a question for
Go.
Pamela and anybody else. Is that concept of interdependency there? Or is it all special interest?
Absolutely.
How so? So if we're talking about hunters and people who hunt and fish, is there a broader concept? I mean, clearly they're very influential in terms of conservation policy, correct?
Yep.
So can you help me understand that how that in that particular instance, where is the interdependency? Where is that concept? How is it expressed?
You mean from hunters and trappers?
Yeah.
I'm just guessing here because I'm not in that camp, but I think it's because they believe that species must be managed, and so they're assuming that role and therefore contributing to conservation overall. My guess.
Nicole.
Yes, I had a lot of thoughts. I agree with that the other participant that the hunting is conservation is as ridiculous as it sounds. I had a couple of thoughts about. I was thinking about those poor ostriches in BC who were killed shot overnight by the Canadian inspection agency under the guise of One Health. They were never even tested for avian flu. And we would never do that to humans. So there's a whole lot of speciesism in this One Health initiative. I mean, the thing is, these ostriches had not had avian flu for 10 months. They had recovered and had antibodies against avian flu. So they ended up killing off immune birds in a really gruesome way, over shooting them overnight, and they ended up with a lot of they'll end up with naive birds who don't have any immunity at next. They restock. So it's the other thing is the other siloing I've seen is with rabies testing, for example, that there have been humane anti-mortem rabies tests that involve saliva, nuchal biopsy samples, blood tests, cerebrospinal fluid tests that do not harm animals, and ones that are done looking for the virus itself, or for the or for fragments of the virus, that without killing for humans, but for animals we still use the barbaric rabies test, the fluorescent antibody test, which involves removing the animal's head and cutting up the brain. It makes no sense whatsoever that we use a perfectly humane, simple test for humans, and then this really barbaric test for animals. It's absolutely absurd. And also, people use One Health as an excuse for animal testing. Oh, animals are very similar to humans, let's test it on animals. But that doesn't really make sense, because the animals in labs are not living in a normal environment. So I really appreciate, applying some of those Belmont principles to animals as well, because One Health should mean, One Health also, I appreciate that One Health also means that human and animal health are One Health, but mental health and physical health are also One Health. So, looking at
Yeah. Let's
human
give
and animal
let's give
mental health.
Joanne you've given us a lot. Let's give Joanne a chance to respond to all of this. This is very rich question, Nicole.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So yeah, thank you for all of those examples. First of all, I cannot defend the decisions regarding the ostriches. Absolutely cannot. With respect to rabies, the accuracy of the knuckle biopsies and all the rest of it's not great. And so I think ultimately there is reluctance to use those tests in other animals, because there's always the possibility that that other animal has rabies. And because if rabies were not nearly 100% fatal, I think they would be, or were less fatal, much less fatal. I think that we might consider doing that, but that is the real concern right now in terms of applying those other tests. And that's why we continue to use the immunofluorescent antibody test and test brains post-mortem. It's the slight possibility that it could still have rabies and then could infect an individual or a human
There's
person.
also, let me just say, but there is actually a latex agglutination test called the Dyne Immune test that's actually really good, and a saliva test. And the other thing is there is actually a greater possibility that a human could be infected, because you could dissect an animal's brain and the rabies has not yet reached the brain, but it's reached the salivary glands, because it reaches the salivary glands first. So you're more likely testing post-mortem by cutting off the head and slicing up the brain, or putting a straw in the back of the animal's head and drawing out brain fluid from the, after drilling to their skull. There's more of a chance you might miss rabies in the saliva when the animal is alive, because it's the saliva that's the problem. It's not the brain. So if you do several tests, because I actually created a whole blog, which I put in the chat. I created a blog about all the different rabies tests that are anti-mortem. And if you do a series of them, it's actually pretty accurate. And I think because people don't value animals, we have not put much effort into a humane test. But the thing is, if you just test the brain, you might miss something in the saliva, and the brain does not affect anything. It's just an example of speciesism. If you keep it's such an impractical test. Not only is it completely barbaric, it's completely impractical. And because it's so impractical, this is why rabies is one of the reasons it's still rampant. It's because it's very hard to detect. We need a point of care test because it's so deadly. It's astonishing that not a lot of money or effort has been put into a humane point of care, simple saliva test that could be done, like a latex agglutination test or something that would work. It's just remarkable that
Yes,
hasn't happened.
let's bounce this back to Joanne. What are you thinking, Joanne?
Well, again, I think she makes some really valid points, but I guess this is sort of it's a small part of what I wanted to be a much broader discussion about conservation, and so I have a lot of thoughts. I've worked in rabies a lot, and I have a lot of thoughts about how to not only control rabies but also how to reduce through humane methods the size of free roaming dog populations. I work with a lot of these groups, so your points are well taken. But as far as I know, and I will take a look at your blog, as far as I know, there's still that element of uncertainty, and the goal still is to protect humans at all costs. So that's that trade-off. I think Fred might have had a.
Fred had a, but I want to walk you back to something that was said before, and that was about the interdependencies with hunting. There are a lot of people who, whether they're right or wrong, would say that both subsistence hunting and cultural hunting are examples of that interdependencies. What are your thoughts on the distinction of that kind of hunting in the context of One Health versus, let's say, sports hunting, trophy hunting, recreational hunting, etc.?
I think certainly so I worked in West Africa for a number of years with nomadic and semi-nomadic herders with mixed herds of sheep, goats, camels, and all the rest of it. And I can certainly understand, I mean, that the land been there for millennia, the land supports that kind of abuse and the use of livestock. And for those individuals, absolutely, I think there's no question there's an interdependency. For us, it's often a choice. For trophy hunters, it's not. I mean, can you say that hanging a hat on your wall there's some dependency there? I don't see it. So I think there are absolutely, for certain groups, the small landholder farmers in Indonesia, the mixed herders, nomadic herders in West Africa. And when I was there, after I was there, 1984 was a year of tremendous drought. When those people lost their animals, or the animals either died or they walked them across the border to Nigeria to sell them at markets, they set up in little patches of dirt in the capital city and begged at stoplights. So there's no question that there's a dependency there. But I think we have to think about it. That is situational as well. And maybe ultimately, there are two different set of sort of One Health ethics here. When people absolutely depend on it versus when it's our choice to go to the supermarket or to go out and shoot something. I don't know.
Interesting.
I mean, I'm interested in it. The question, one of the questions that I would like to have be discussed is conservation. Is there a specific conservation ethics in terms of One Health, or is it even, can it be subdivided? I don't know. Are there broad principles that we can use? Does it apply? Anyway, maybe this is more than.
Maybe there's an opportunity to read a comment from the chat that I think might go to this. It comes from Liz. She mentions, do you have examples of where One Health was applied in a connected environmental species health with public health? I think this is for everyone in the meeting. For example, concerning mercury in fish and fish sustainability, on the west coast of the states of Washington State, the Department of Health was able to provide outreach and info that combined the two issues because mothers were confused by the two issues, mercury in fish and fish sustainability. So maybe that's a good example of where there's some intersectionality and provides sort of a framework for thinking about this. Are there other examples, and do folks here have other examples they would like to share?
I just want to make a comment, and then I'd be interested in other people's examples. I think the immediate response is to say, okay, we're going to protect people, and the heck with everything else. I think we often do not take those upstream approaches because they're more complicated. They cost a lot of money. We're not investing directly in people. We may be investing in health of fish species. So I have not seen a lot of those kinds of examples where we're focused, where we have a health problem that affects people, and it originates in an animal species, but I have rarely seen the example of protecting the animal species or taking necessary steps to keep an animal species healthy, to keep a human species healthy. I'd be interested to see if other people have examples. But I think a lot of this, let's be honest, there are political decisions. And what do our politicians understand about that? What are they, are they prepared to spend the money to make the decisions to fight for an upstream solution when it's so easy just to wall the human population off and do something that's quick and dirty?
Colleen, you've had your hand raised for a minute there. I wonder if you want to contribute to this conversation, to this part of the conversation, or is there something else you wanted to bring up?
Yeah, no, this actually ties in quite closely with what I was thinking of discussing. And hi, Bill, good to see you. Bill and I had what was going to be a 15-minute conversation, I think, a few months ago, and it turned into like a 3-hour conversation on this topic. So I primarily work in science communications, and I specialize in marine science conservation, with even more specialty in sustainable seafood and shark conservation. And so sharks are one of those species that are not attractive to conserve. There's even an initiative out there called the Fuzzy Shark Initiative right now, trying to get people more excited about them and think they're cuter. We won't go into that, but I've been working with zoos and aquariums for a little over the past decade, in terms of messaging around sharks and sustainable seafood and coastal resiliency and the interconnectedness of that. And because, unsustainable fishing practices, including bycatch, maybe primarily bycatch, is the largest threat to shark populations. And so getting this message out, I think, is what we are trying to do. I work with about 30 other zoos and aquariums across the US and several other global orgs, but we're trying to promote that message that, sharks help ecosystems. Their health is connected to our own. Without the health of sharks, we're not necessarily eating them, especially in North America. We do, but not to the extent of some other nations. But we rely on them for healthy fish populations. We rely on them, the fishing community, to I could go into the details of how often I've spoken with the fishing community, and they're at odds with what we're saying, that sharks help the fish. But it was just interesting talking about seafood and looking at sustainable seafood. And yes, there's the direct measurement of things like mercury and now nanoplastics and microplastics in our seafood, but just the health overall of these populations, and the livelihoods of coastal communities, as well as just the sheer number of people globally that rely on fish as their primary source of protein. So we're trying right now to connect the conservation of sharks directly with the health of humans. So excited to hear that this is expanding into other areas and see this area.
So I'm curious, to whom are you making that argument, and how successful are you being? Because it's very difficult when it gets past the, the pet at home or the piece of meat on the plate. It's very hard to make that connection.
It is. It absolutely is. And I love the challenge of it, especially with something like sharks, because it is so difficult. A tool that has been very successful, and I know it can be controversial, but using animals under human care, sharks. So, I personally used to get in as a diver and give presentations on this topic from inside the shark habitat, and that would be very effective, showing that these animals are not a huge threat and connecting people with these animals. So we do use, zoos and aquariums as tools to get people to have these one-on-one interactions with these animals and form that connection with them, which, as we know, empathy is the only way to inspire any action. We need to have empathy. We need to have emotion. And while sharks are not cute and fuzzy, as our fish are not, there are ways to create those connections and then connect that with the importance. So the general public is our target audience because that is who is primarily going into those facilities that I'm working with, and then but that elevates into policy makers.
Right.
And I work also with the the fishing community. I used to live in the Outer Banks. Don't recommend it, but it's a large fishing community there, and they're not fond of sharks, as are many fishing communities. So engaging with that population and showing the benefits of keeping these animals around, and also even creating that empathy factor and showing, these things directly impact your daily life. And it's
So that's my, that was my
science
comment.
and conservation and sustainability as a whole struggle to connect people with the problems. So things like, the climate crisis, people don't care necessarily about the polar bears. They care about, how much does their gas cost? How much does it cost to feed their kids? Yeah, the polar bears are cute, but if I can't feed my kids, so what? So I think that's something I personally work on and I'm very passionate about, is trying to make these connections, to make an impact. And hopefully
Ultimately,
we'll do that together.
You have to make the connection to the policymakers, the decision makers, and they are woefully ignorant of. Well, certainly, we just did a research project about the understanding and the knowledge of One Health in local communities, and it's just, the term is not even understood. And when local communities make decisions about whether to clear cut 100 acres of land next to the railroad, is anybody there advocating for the wildlife that lives there? Is anybody advocating for the fact that the trees are providing oxygen? No, they're not.
No.
Not.
So Teresa has been waiting for a while.
Yes, I know.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. We can see you too. Hello.
Okay. Hello. Great. So I would like to answer more upon that connection with One Health and conservation itself. And from my previous work as a grad student, where I actually did some research talking with different rice farmers in Dominican Republic to see how well they can identify the sort of benefits and I guess harm that wild bird species might have on their farming production and on their health overall. And overall, I mean, obviously One Health is, nobody here knows One Health, the concept itself, but can indirectly tell you, oh yes, I noticed that when there's high levels of disease or let's say sort of contaminants within my rice system, I'm not seeing as many birds, or I'm not seeing as many of the beneficial insects that help me and such. And the same way with the current project I'm working on with livestock farmers, while they can't make the distinction, while they kind of to, let's say, to finally distinct what is animal health to them, what is, or in this case, when they say animal health, they're thinking about their livestock, not so much as the wildlife, and what is human health, what's environmental health. Again, there's not that understanding, but there is an understanding that there's a connection. Well, if my livestock is unhealthy, that might be a sign that there's something already going on within the environment. Say there's severe drought or whatnot. Or in my case, as a farmer, for example, I'd say, well, if I'm unhealthy, I'm not going to be able to properly manage my herd and give them the attention that they need, and therefore exposing them perhaps to more diseases and such. So I think ultimately, yeah, and yes, there is an understanding of the importance of conservation within One Health, but there's, I think, overall not as much as a connection as they should be, as opposed to only focusing on the disease dynamics, as opposed to also, biodiversity and just healthy ecosystems in general. That's my opinion on the matter.
Thank you for that.
What do you think in return, Joanne?
Well, I think it's true that, you don't, do we pay attention? I've noticed that, so I live near a lake, a river, and I've noticed in the past 2 years that the bird species almost across the board have been declining, at least in this area. And went to my local Wild Birds Unlimited store to get bird seed, and was asking questions about avian influenza. Anybody noticing anything? Nobody's noticed anything at all. And I think, we're so busy, we fail to really pay attention to what is going on around us in nature. And so much of our environment is human built in any case that, would we necessarily, even if we had access, would we notice it? So I think it's a question of awareness. Are we making those connections? Are we asking the questions? Are we asking the questions of the right people? And even then, who's going to do the research? Who's going to do something about it? Who's going to look into it? Where is the funding going to come from? So, I think those are all issues. I don't know. I just despair. I mean, we all know that or I think we all know that there's, a huge decline in insect populations. And, my concern is, what are we doing about that besides noticing that there are fewer dead bugs on our windshields? What is this going to do in 10, 20, 50 years to the survival of everything? I worry about that. But again, I think, some of this, most of the attention is just placed on humans right now, as opposed, and it's one out of how many millions of species, and yet we don't seem to be paying much attention to everything else. And that's the context in which we live. I don't know what the solution is. I don't know. If anybody does, I'd love to hear it. Do we just throw up our hands and say, well, we can't do anything about it? It's always going to be that way. We're flawed. I don't know.
I mean, I think we just have to accept that as a part of general human psychology and use it to our advantage. Figure out the ways to utilize, messaging that goes towards that and get our goals in that way. So
I just saw a very interesting comment. I haven't really been looking at the comments, but I just saw a really interesting comment by Gina. Gina here? Where's Gina? Gina's hiding?
She may have left. We're a few
Okay.
minutes over the
Oh,
normal
I'm sorry.
time.
Okay,
That's
well,
okay.
I'll just read it. I'll just read it. She says, we cannot conserve other species until we recognize them as relatives. And this, I think, goes back to one of the heart of the problem, which is, why does even One Health say people, animals, nature, or environment? It's how we talk about it's our failure to recognize that We are members of the animal kingdom. Fred wants to speak on that. Fred.
Well, actually, I know we're getting probably towards the end, so I was just going to mention a couple things because in 2 weeks I'm going to be following this and speaking about it. And what I heard today, it reminds me of a couple of things that I'll be talking about. One is how important language is, and we'll go through in 2 weeks about how certain critical words in the One Health paradigm, people say, language begins in your mind and then the receiver receives it, but they're not always matching. And that's particularly important in this particular paradigm. And One Health is really a paradigm, right? It's a conceptual framework of how we can go. The other thing I'll be talking about is more of the early history, not so much like the normal historian kind of approach, but more. I'm in my seventh decade, okay, and so when I was a child, my mother was a history buff, and she dragged me off. I saw every historical feature east of the Mississippi, and I hated it, so I went into biology. But now that I'm 7 decades old, history's a lot more interesting when you lived it. And I actually had the luck of being involved at Wildlife Conservation Society and other groups when the concept of One Health and all these related health ideas were being mixed with biodiversity. And so what I'm going to be talking about in 2 weeks is how some of these early, like why did we jump onto emerging diseases and what was the motivation behind, developing these concepts? Anyway, long story short is I think that as all ideas are based on context, right? And ideas evolve and change. And the context of One Health keeps changing.
It does.
So what's really exciting is how this changing context is involving biodiversity conservationists more and more, and the language behind it and the ethics behind it. And it's very useful, though, to look back to the beginning and think about how we got off on the track we got on and how it can evolve and change and be more productive and offer a little bit more hope than the pessimism that drives most of us 70-year-old folks. So anyway, that's my spiel for join us in 2 weeks and hear more.
And I share your hope too, Fred, but I think, we've seen from the original One Health, One Medicine to a very brief definition of One Health to where we are right now, it's clearly evolved. And I think out of necessity, and probably because things are going to get much worse, we're going to be forced. I wish I'd like to think that we would do it because it's the right thing to do. But I think we're going to be forced to focus more on the ethics of One Health, especially the thing that concerns me is trade-offs. That is something that nobody wants to touch. Are we going to ultimately make a decision in favor of a species of other animal that will not necessarily privilege humans? And who's going to make those decisions? And the justice issue, it runs straight into, justice, human concepts of justice. These are really going to be tough decisions. Sort of reminds me of John Silber, who was president of Boston University, who made a statement about old people they were the low-hanging fruit and they should just drop off the tree because we shouldn't put money into saving them. This huge uproar. And so, we're going to get into some really tricky decisions here, I think, and not pleasant ones. Anyway, we kind of get off